Do you know the 7 sins that Saint Teresa of Avila says you should confess this Easter Monday? Not the usual ones, not the ones you've been bringing to the confessional year after year. 7 specific sins that are born in the soul precisely during the Easter season. Sins that hide behind joy, behind the Alleluia, behind the communion you just received. Sins that Saint Teresa of Avila identified one by one with a clarity that left her own confessors speechless. Sins that devout Christians rarely recognize as sins at all. Sins that have been living inside the soul for weeks, months, sometimes years, without anyone ever naming them. Do you carry any of them? Is your soul truly clean before the risen Christ? Or is there something that still needs to be confessed today? This Easter Monday is the first day of the new soul. That is how Saint Teresa of Avila understood it. In her writings, she pointed out with great precision why this particular day on the liturgical calendar demands a different kind of confession, a deeper one, a more courageous one, unlike any other. Because the grace of the resurrection needs an open door to enter, and these 7 sins are exactly that. 7 closed doors that prevent the risen Christ from completing his work in the soul. Write the word "He is risen" in the comments right now as an act of faith, and so that Saint Teresa of Avila might intercede for you today. And if you haven't yet joined this spiritual family, subscribe now to receive each week the deepest teachings of the great Catholic mystics. What Saint Teresa of Avila revealed about the 7th of these sins will permanently change the way you prepare for confession. Easter Monday carries a spiritual weight that most Christians simply don't know about. It is not a day of rest after the celebration. It is not the Monday when you take down the decorations and return to ordinary life. In the oldest Catholic tradition, Easter Monday is the first day of new life, the first dawn of the soul that has just passed through the death and resurrection of its Lord. And Saint Teresa of Avila understood this with a depth that few of her contemporaries ever fully grasped. When Saint Teresa of Avila spoke of the Easter season, she was not speaking of a celebration. She was speaking of a transformation. She was speaking of what happens inside the soul when the grace of the resurrection enters without obstacles and begins to do its work. And she used an image that appears repeatedly throughout her writings, especially in the way of perfection, the image of the castle that throws open its doors. A castle that throughout all of Lent has been preparing itself, purifying itself, emptying itself of everything unnecessary, so that on Easter morning, the king can enter all the way to the innermost chambers without meeting any resistance. But Saint Teresa of Avila also knew that this does not always happen, that there are souls who celebrate the resurrection with every ounce of faith they possess, who go to Mass, who receive communion, who pray the rosary, and who nonetheless arrive at Easter Monday with the castle still locked from the inside, not out of ill will, not out of any lack of love for God, but because there are 7 sins that settle into the soul with such perfect discretion that devout Christians rarely recognize them for what they are. They disguise themselves as habit. They disguise themselves as virtue. They disguise themselves as perfectly justified spiritual fatigue. And so they remain, closing doors, blocking grace, preventing the resurrection from doing in the soul what it came to do. Saint Teresa of Avila did not arrive at this understanding overnight. She herself confessed in the book of her life that for many years of her religious life, she lived in exactly that state, participating in the sacraments, fulfilling the obligations of her vocation, and yet feeling that something inside her remained closed, distant, unable to fully receive the grace God was offering her. Years later, when God granted her the grace of contemplative prayer, and she began to understand clearly what had happened during that long period of spiritual lukewarmness, she identified with precision what those obstacles had been, and she wrote it down. She wrote it down with the courage of someone who had endured that pain and wanted to spare others the same long journey. What Saint Teresa of Avila described are not grave sins in the way the world understands gravity. They are not crimes or scandals. They are sins of the interior soul, sins of the spiritual life, sins that only a person who already has a relationship with God can commit, and precisely because of that relationship can damage it in very subtle ways. These are sins that don't appear in the usual examinations of conscience, because they are not about what the Christian does, but about what the Christian is on the inside. The quality of their relationship with God, the honesty of their prayer life, the truth of their love. And there is something that Saint Teresa of Avila emphasized with particular force when she spoke of these 7 sins in relation to the Easter season. They are more dangerous at Easter than at any other point in the entire liturgical year, not because God is more severe at Easter, but because the grace God offers at Easter is greater than at any other time. And when the soul has access to an extraordinary grace, but allows it to pass by unreceived, because there are unconfessed obstacles in the way, the loss is proportionally greater. Saint Teresa of Avila expressed this with an image found in the interior castle, an image of such clarity it stops the heart. It is like standing before a clear spring of water at the moment of your greatest thirst, and being unable to drink because your mouth is locked shut from the inside. Easter Monday is that moment. The spring is open, the grace is available. The risen Christ is present in the baptized soul with a closeness that on no other day of the year has this same intensity. And these 7 sins are precisely why so many devout and good-hearted souls arrive at this day feeling, without quite being able to explain it, still a little empty, still a little distant, still waiting for something that they sense should have arrived by now, and that somehow has not quite come. What is the first of the 7? What is the sin that Saint Teresa of Avila mentioned most persistently in her writings? The one she herself admitted to having carried during the darkest years of her spiritual life. The one she described as the hardest chain to see precisely because it shines as though it were made of gold. It has to do with something you are probably doing right now, in this very moment, as you listen to these words. Something you do with the best of intentions. Something you learned as a child and always considered a virtue, and which Saint Teresa of Avila, with that characteristic courage that made her a doctor of the Church, dared to call by its true name. There is a sin that devout Christians commit on Easter Sunday with a frequency that Saint Teresa of Avila found deeply troubling, and that no one mentions in sermons, no one includes in examinations of conscience, no one brings to confession because no one recognizes it for what it is. It has no dramatic name, it causes no scandal. From the outside, it looks like exactly the opposite of a sin. From the outside, it looks like devotion. It is called performed joy, not conscious hypocrisy, not deliberate deception. Saint Teresa of Avila was not speaking of someone who pretends in front of others while knowing they are pretending. She was speaking of something far more subtle and far more painful. The soul that has learned to celebrate on the outside what it has not yet resolved on the inside. The soul that sings the Alleluia in church because it knows it should sing it, feels it as an obligation of faith, and yet carries in that very moment an undelivered grief, an unhealed wound, an unanswered question that has been living in silence in the interior for months or years. Saint Teresa of Avila knew that state from the inside. In the book of her life, she described with a frankness that is still astonishing the years in which she participated in the liturgical celebrations of her convent with every outward correctness her vocation demanded, while inwardly experiencing what she called a dryness that kept her from praying with truth. It was not a lack of faith. It was a lack of interior honesty. It was a soul that had not dared to bring before God what it was actually living through, and that therefore appeared before Him wearing a face that was not entirely its own. And that, said Saint Teresa of Avila, is a sin that requires confession. Not because God is offended by pain, not because feeling empty at Easter is wrong, but because the soul that does not bring its truth to the confessional is choosing, consciously or not, to maintain a distance from God that prevents full communion. It is saying through its silence, "This I will not hand over. This I will keep for myself." And that act of withholding something from God, that interior reserve that the soul maintains even in the greatest celebration of the entire liturgical year, is precisely what Saint Teresa of Avila identified as the first obstacle between the soul and Easter grace. In the interior castle, Saint Teresa of Avila described the soul as a crystal castle with many rooms. And she noted that there are souls who manage to enter the outer rooms of the castle, who receive the sacraments, who fulfill their religious obligations, who live lives that from the outside appear entirely ordered toward God, but who never reach the inner rooms because they carry something they have refused to leave at the door. Something personal, something painful, something that at some point they decided was too intimate, too complicated, too shameful to bring to the confessional in actual words. And that something becomes an invisible wall inside the castle, a wall the soul cannot see because it has grown used to it, a wall that prevents the light of grace from reaching the corners where it is needed most. What is that something for you? What do you bring to Easter Mass in silence, held close, hidden behind a smile, while it remains unresolved on the inside? Saint Teresa of Avila did not ask you to resolve it before confessing it. She asked exactly the opposite. Bring it to the confessional precisely because you don't know how to resolve it on your own. Put it into words, even clumsy ones. Name before the priest that sorrow that never quite ends, that fear that never quite goes away, that joy that never arrives no matter how sincerely you search for it. Because the confessional is not only the place where grave sins are forgiven, it is the place where the soul can set down what it has been carrying. It is the place where that invisible wall can come down with a single sentence spoken in truce. Saint Teresa of Avila was extraordinarily practical in her instructions about confession. In the way of perfection, she insisted that frequent and sincere confession is not merely a remedy for mortal sin. It is the primary instrument God uses to keep the soul in a state of spiritual growth. And she pointed out that the greatest mistake devout Christians make is saving confession for moments of serious crisis, for the sins they themselves recognize as grave, and letting everything else go unconfessed. The lukewarmness, the spiritual sadness, the joy that never arrives, the pain that has never been surrendered. All of that needs confession, not because it is mortal sin in the canonical sense, but because naming those things before God, in the sacrament He Himself established to cleanse the soul, produces a grace that private prayer alone cannot produce. It produces the specific grace of the sacrament, the grace that heals, that liberates, that opens the doors of the interior castle and lets the light pour in. The Christian who arrives at this Easter Monday carrying a performed joy, an outward celebration that does not match what they are actually living inside, has in this day an opportunity that Saint Teresa of Avila described as extraordinary. Because Easter grace and the grace of the sacrament of confession strengthen each other during this season in a way that happens at no other moment of the year. And the second sin that Saint Teresa of Avila identified is so close to the first that many souls carry both of them at once, without realizing they are two distinct wounds that call for two distinct acts of surrender. There is a resentment unlike all others. It is not the resentment that springs from a recent wound. It is not the fresh anger of someone who has just been hurt. Saint Teresa of Avila spoke of a specific kind of resentment, one that the devout soul carries with a misguided patience. A resentment that survived all of Lent, that survived the devotional practices of Holy Week, that survived even the emotion of the Easter Vigil, and that surfaces on Easter Monday morning as intact as if nothing had happened. That resentment that outlives the resurrection. Saint Teresa of Avila described it in the way of perfection, with an image that, once heard, is never forgotten. She said that this kind of resentment is like a stone the soul has carried so long, it no longer feels the weight. A stone it has held in its hands for so many years that it can no longer remember what it felt like to have empty hands. And the problem is not only the weight of the stone. The problem is that while the soul's hands are occupied holding that stone, it cannot open its arms to receive what God wants to give it. Who have you not yet forgiven? I am not speaking of forgiving with the mind, which is what most devout Christians do when asked that question. I am speaking of forgiving with the body, with the gut, with that place in the soul where it still hurts when you think of that person. Is there someone like that in your life? Someone whose name comes to mind in moments of prayer and steals your peace? Someone you told yourself you forgave? Perhaps someone who is no longer in this world, and yet whose memory still produces in you something that is not peace. Saint Teresa of Avila was utterly clear on this point. That is resentment. And resentment, however old, however quiet, however well it has learned to coexist with prayers and communions and rosaries, needs confession. Not because God cannot see it without the confession, but because the soul needs the concrete act of naming it before a priest, of acknowledging in words that there is a wound that is not fully healed, for the grace of the sacrament to enter precisely where the wound is. What makes this sin especially difficult to bring to confession is that the devout Christian has usually worked on it quite a bit already, has usually prayed for that person, has usually asked God for the grace of forgiveness on many occasions, and precisely because they have done that work, they feel that they have already forgiven, that it is resolved, that there is nothing to confess about it anymore. Saint Teresa of Avila answered that logic with a precision that leaves no room for evasion. In the Interior Castle, she wrote that there is a difference between asking for the grace of forgiveness and having fully received that grace. That the soul can desire to forgive with complete sincerity and still not have arrived at the interior freedom that complete forgiveness produces. And that, as long as that freedom has not come, as long as there remains any trace of pain or distance or judgment toward that person, the soul is called to keep bringing that to the sacrament, not as failure, but as spiritual honesty. Because the confessional is not the place you go when you have already sorted everything out. It is the place you go with what you have not yet been able to sort out on your own. There was a sister in Saint Teresa of Avila's convent who had carried for years a resentment toward a family member who had wounded her deeply before entering religious life. She was a woman of genuine prayer, of exemplary life, of devotion recognized by all her sisters. But in every confession, she left that point out. Not because she was lying, but in her heart, she had decided that she had already worked through it sufficiently in private prayer, and that bringing it to the confessional would be like starting over on something she considered closed. Saint Teresa of Avila, who possessed that gift of seeing into souls that God grants to the contemplatives, asked her one day simply to name it in confession. Not to explain it, not to tell the whole story, just to name it. To say to the priest, "There is still a residue of pain in me toward this person, and I have not been able to let it go entirely." The sister did, and she described afterward what happened as something for which she had no adequate words. She said that in the moment the priest pronounced the words of absolution, she felt something release inside her chest, something that had been tight for years and that in that moment for the first time loosened. It did not vanish all at once, but it began to move. It began to let go. And in the days that followed, she felt a freedom in prayer she had never known in all her years of religious life. That is the effect the Saint Teresa of Avila promised for whoever has the courage to bring to the confessional this Easter Monday the resentment that has outlasted everything else. But there is a third sin that Saint Teresa of Avila considered even more widespread than the 2 previous ones among devout souls. A sin that does not ache the way resentment does. That does not feel like a burden the way performed joy does. That in fact feels like rest, like relief, like something entirely natural after the effort of Lent. And it is precisely that feeling of naturalness that makes it so difficult to recognize as the sin it is. After Lent, the devout soul feels it has earned a rest. It fasted, it prayed more, it went to more masses, it made sacrifices it doesn't normally make at other times of year. And when Easter arrives, when the bells ring and the Alleluia fills the church, something inside the soul says, I've done my part. I've done what needed to be done. Now I can ease off a little. Saint Teresa of Avila called that easing off by its name, renewed lukewarmness. Not the lukewarmness of someone who never had any fervor. Something far more specific and far more dangerous. The lukewarmness of someone who had fervor, sustained it with effort throughout all of Lent, and who now, at the precise moment when grace is most available, unconsciously decides to pull back, to return to the prayer life of before, to return to Sunday communion only, to return to that relationship with God that is correct, that is enough to meet the minimum, but that falls far short of the intimacy God desires and that Lent had begun to build. In the way of perfection, Saint Teresa of Avila was extraordinarily direct about this. She wrote that the soul that labors hard in Lent and then abandons that labor at Easter does not merely lose what it gained, it goes backward. Because the spiritual soul does not work like a tank that fills up and stays full. It works like a muscle, and a muscle that is not exercised grows weak. And the most dangerous moment for that weakening is precisely when the soul believes it no longer needs as much effort because it has already reached the goal. Easter is not the goal. Easter is the beginning. Saint Teresa of Avila insisted on this with an energy that you can feel on every page of the Way of Perfection. The resurrection of Christ is not the end point of the Christian's spiritual journey. It is the starting point of new life. It is the moment when the soul that has been emptied during Lent should be more open, more available, more hungry for God than at any other moment of the year. And yet instead of that, what Saint Teresa of Avila observed with sorrow in the souls around her, and what she herself admitted to having experienced during her years of lukewarmness, was exactly the opposite. The relief of having completed the Lenten effort produced a slackening that left the soul more empty after Easter than it had been before Lent. That is the third sin. And it needs confession, not because it is mortal sin, but because naming it before God, acknowledging before the priest that the soul has slipped back into lukewarmness after the Lenten effort, activates a specific grace that private prayer cannot produce, the grace of perseverance, the grace that prevents Lenten fervor from dying in Easter joy, and instead allows it to flower within it. But there is a fourth sin that Saint Teresa of Avila considered inseparable from this third, because renewed lukewarmness almost always comes accompanied by something that is its twin, something with the same root, but that manifests in the opposite direction. If lukewarmness is the soul that relaxes its spiritual effort, believing it has already done enough, its twin is the soul that does not relax its effort, but develops around that effort an interior satisfaction that Saint Teresa of Avila identified as one of the most subtle and most damaging forms of spiritual pride. Easter spiritual pride, not the pride of the sinner who refuses to acknowledge wrongdoing. That is a crude pride that any soul of prayer recognizes easily. Saint Teresa of Avila was speaking of a far more refined pride, that of the Christian who has kept Lent well, who fulfilled the penances, who attended all the Holy Week services, who received communion at the Easter Vigil, and who arrives at Easter Monday with an interior satisfaction that is not the peace of God, but the satisfaction of self. A satisfaction that at its core says, I've done it. I'm a good Christian. I did what needed to be done. In the interior castle, Saint Teresa of Avila described this state with a striking image. She said that the soul who comes to God, satisfied with its own merits, is like someone who arrives at a banquet already full. They are present. They are seated at the table, but they cannot receive the food being offered because they already feel satisfied with what is their own. God's grace cannot enter a soul that is satisfied with itself, not because God withholds it, but because the self-satisfied soul has no hunger, and grace needs hunger in order to be received. Saint Teresa of Avila had lived that spiritual pride for years without recognizing it. She confessed as much in the book of her life with a candor that still moves readers today. During a long period of her religious life, the greatest obstacle to deep prayer was not distraction or lukewarmness, but precisely this: a subtle self-satisfaction with her own spiritual life that prevented her from opening herself completely to God's action. That caused her to come before God not with empty open hands, which is the posture of the soul that can receive, but with hands full of her own works, her own virtues, her own efforts. In her own words, Saint Teresa of Avila wrote in the book of her life, "I was very much afraid of prayer, for it seemed to me that if I turned to it, I would see how far I was from being what I ought to be, and I preferred not to look." That averted gaze, that examination postponed because the soul prefers to hold on to the favorable image it has of itself, is precisely the heart of Easter spiritual pride. And the fifth sin that Saint Teresa of Avila identified has something in common with this force. It too has to do with a kind of satisfaction, but not the soul's satisfaction with itself, the soul's comfort in its own sorrow. There is a natural tendency in the human soul that Saint Teresa of Avila observed with concern throughout her entire life as a spiritual teacher. When joy arrives, the departed are forgotten, not out of ill will, not out of lack of love, but because joy has that power to draw the soul's attention toward the living, toward what can be seen and touched and celebrated, and to push to the background everything that belongs to the invisible world. During Lent, the departed are close. The purple of the altars, the silence of the liturgies, the meditation on death and final judgment that forms part of penitential spirituality, all of it keeps alive in the soul the memory of those who have gone before and the awareness that they still need the prayers of the living. But when Easter arrives, when the altars fill with white flowers and the Alleluia replaces the silence, that memory tends to recede, and the souls in purgatory, who have not stopped needing prayer for a single day, are pushed to a background that Saint Teresa of Avila considered a serious spiritual error, not just an oversight, a sin that needs confession. Saint Teresa of Avila had an extraordinary devotion to the souls in purgatory that runs through all her writings with remarkable consistency. In the book of her life, she recounted several experiences in which God showed her the condition of souls she knew who were in purgatory. Souls who asked her for prayers, souls whose suffering she could perceive with a clarity that caused her physical pain. And in each of those experiences, Saint Teresa of Avila came away with the same certainty. The souls in purgatory depend on the living. They have no other source of relief than the prayers, the masses, the communions, and the penances that the living offer for them. And if the living forget them in times of joy, that forgetting has real consequences, not in the sense that God punishes the one who forgets, but in the sense that souls who could have been helped do not receive the help they needed. And the Christian, who had in their hands the possibility of easing that suffering and let it pass, through distraction or through too much absorption in their own happiness, carries in their conscience a spiritual debt that Saint Teresa of Avila asked to be brought to the confessional with complete honesty. But there is something more that Saint Teresa of Avila emphasized about the relationship between the Easter season and the souls in purgatory. something very few people know, and that completely changes the way we understand this forgetting as a sin. She said that Easter grace is not available only to the living, that the resurrection of Christ has an effect on purgatory that no other time of the liturgical year produces with the same intensity. That when the living pray for their departed during the Easter season, that prayer carries with it a specific grace of the resurrection that accelerates the soul's purification in an extraordinary way. She explained it with an image found in the interior castle, one that, once heard, stays with the soul. She said that purgatory during the Easter season is like a garden receiving more sunlight than at any other time of year. Flowers grow faster. Purification advances at a speed that at other times is simply not possible. And the soul on earth who sends prayers to that garden during this season is doing something of incalculable spiritual value. Have you prayed for your departed loved ones this Easter Monday? Have you offered your Easter communion for the soul of someone you love who is no longer in this world? Have you asked the risen Christ that his light of resurrection illuminate purgatory and speed the purification of the souls you know who wait there? If you have not, Saint Teresa of Avila would say that this is an omission that deserves confession, not an omission of grave sin, but an omission of love, one the soul should acknowledge with humility before God. Because love for the departed is not optional for the Christian, it is part of the most fundamental charity, a charity that does not stop at death, because it knows that death cannot sever the bonds that God blessed in life. Saint Teresa of Avila was especially sensitive to this in relation to deceased parents. She observed that many of her contemporaries, men and women of genuine faith, prayed regularly for their parents while grief was fresh, and then, as years passed, that prayer became increasingly sporadic until it nearly disappeared. And she warned that this gradual abandonment of prayer for deceased parents was a form of spiritual ingratitude that the soul needed to acknowledge and correct. Because the parents who gave us life, who carried us to baptism, who taught us to pray, who passed on the faith that allows us to hear these words today, they may still be in purgatory, waiting for their children to remember them, waiting for the Easter joy of their children to include a prayer, a mass, a communion offered for their purification. This Easter Monday is the exact right moment for that, to name the forgetting in confession, to offer the Easter grace for the souls of those you have loved most in this life, to let the joy of the resurrection be not only yours, but belong to everyone you carry in your heart, both the living and the dead. And the sixth sin that Saint Teresa of Avila identified is connected to this fifth in a way that may surprise you at first, because it too involves a forgetting, but not the forgetting of the departed, the forgetting of something that happened just 2 days ago, something the soul has already begun to leave behind with a speed that Saint Teresa of Avila considered one of the most costly spiritual mistakes a devout Christian can make. 2 days ago, you received the risen Christ in the Eucharist. At the Easter Mass or at the Easter Vigil, you opened your hands or bowed your head and received the body and blood of the one who conquered death. Not a symbolic presence, not a memory. The real, living, risen presence of Jesus Christ inside your body. And today, Easter Monday, Saint Teresa of Avila asks a question that stings in its simplicity. How much time did you spend after that communion simply being with Him? Eucharistic ingratitude is the sixth sin that Saint Teresa of Avila identified as one of the most widespread among devout souls, and also one of the most painful for the heart of God. It is not the ingratitude of the unbeliever. It is the ingratitude of someone who believes deeply, who receives communion with genuine devotion, who kneels with reverence and accepts the sacrament with love, and who nonetheless, the moment Mass ends, returns immediately to their thoughts, their conversations, their worries, as though what they just received were already something that belongs to the past. Saint Teresa of Avila spoke of this in the book of her life with an intensity that leaves no room for comfort. She described communion as the moment when the soul has God closer to it than at any other moment of earthly life, closer than in the most elevated prayer, closer than in the deepest contemplation. Because in prayer, God touches the soul from the outside, so to speak, with His grace and presence. But in communion, God enters within. He becomes one with the body and the soul of the one who receives Him. And that moment of union, said Saint Teresa of Avila, is the most precious moment in the entire spiritual life of any Christian. And yet it is the moment that devout Christians most frequently waste, not out of bad will, out of habit, out of the rushed pace of the Sunday Mass that ends and now you have to move. Greet people, collect the children, think about lunch. Out of that inability, the modern soul has to stop, to be still, to hold in silence something it has just received that deserves all the time in the world. In her own words, Saint Teresa of Avila wrote in the book of her life, "After you have received communion, try to remain a little while with the Lord. If your body prevents you, prevent your soul from abandoning so good a friend." These words, written in the 16th century for Carmelite nuns, arrive at Easter Monday of the 21st century with a relevance that is astonishing. Because the problem Saint Teresa of Avila was describing then is precisely the same problem the devout Christian faces today, with the difference that today the pace is even faster and silence is even harder to sustain. What did you do after receiving communion at the Easter Mass? Did you remain in silence with Him, even for a few minutes? Did you speak to Him? Did you thank Him? Did you ask Him for something specific for your soul, for your family, for the people who most need His grace? Or did the emotion of the day, the joy of the celebration, the movement of the gathering carry you back to the surface before that communion had time to do in you everything it could have done? Saint Teresa of Avila was not asking for hours of adoration after every communion. She understood perfectly that the Christian living in the world has responsibilities that cannot be set aside. But she asked for minutes. She asked for that minimum space of interior silence in which the soul says to God that it knows what it just received, that it has not forgotten, that it carries Him with it. Because that act of acknowledgement, that concrete and conscious gratitude, opens in the soul a channel of grace that remains open long after the moment of communion itself, and that produces spiritual effects extending across the entire day, the entire week, sometimes for months at a time. And when that channel does not open, when the soul receives communion and returns immediately to its affairs without that moment of recognition, the grace does not disappear, because God does not take back what He gives, but it remains as though blocked, as though held in reserve, waiting for the soul to pause and receive it consciously. And while it waits, the soul moves through its day, feeling strangely empty, despite having received communion, feeling distant from God, despite having received Him within, unable to quite understand why the peace that should be there has not arrived. That is the consequence of Eucharistic ingratitude. And like all the sins that Saint Teresa of Avila identified on this list, it needs to be named in confession, not because God does not know it happened, but because the soul that has the humility to acknowledge before a priest that it has received communion frequently without the gratitude and silence that the sacrament deserves, receives in that moment the specific grace of a deeper Eucharistic awareness that permanently transforms the way it approaches the altar. This Easter Monday, before the day is over, there is still time for that act of gratitude that may have been missing on Sunday. To sit in silence for even 10 minutes and tell the risen Christ that you have not forgotten Him, that the joy of Easter was not only the joy of the feast, but the joy of having received Him, of having carried Him within, of knowing that He is alive and that His life is yours. And the seventh sin, the last of those Saint Teresa of Avila identified, is the one she herself called the root of all the others, the one that, if left unconfessed, causes all six of the others to return again and again, no matter how many times you try to correct them. The sin the devout Christian knows better than any other. And that, precisely because of that familiarity, is the one most often left out of confession. There is a sin that Saint Teresa of Avila placed last on this list, not because it is the least serious, but because it is the most serious of all. The seventh sin is not a sin committed directly against God. It is a sin committed against the soul itself. It is the sin of arriving at this Easter Monday without having gone to confession, or of having made a confession that was incomplete, or of having received Easter communion without the sacramental preparation it deserves. Saint Teresa of Avila called it the sin of the closed door, because all the previous sins, all the obstacles we have walked through, are doors the soul can open with the grace of the sacrament of confession. But this seventh sin is different. It is the door that remains closed, not because there is something specific left unconfessed, but because the soul has decided, consciously or not to enter the confessional at all. Not during Lent, not during Holy Week, not on this Easter Monday. Why does the devout Christian avoid going to confession? Saint Teresa of Avila listed the reasons with a precision that seems written for the 21st century. The first is fear, not fear of the priest as a person, but that interior fear the soul experiences when it comes too close to its own truth. The fear of naming what has been stored away, the fear that once named, it can no longer be ignored, the fear of genuine conversion, of real change, of having to become different from who one has been for years. The second reason Saint Teresa of Avila identified is shame, and she was very specific in distinguishing between healthy shame, which springs from love of God and produces genuine contrition, and unhealthy shame, which springs from pride and produces paralysis. The unhealthy shame tells the soul, if you confess that, the priest will think less of you. If you confess that, you will have to face what you really are. If you confess that, you will no longer be able to maintain the image of a devout Christian you have been building for years. And that shame, said Saint Teresa of Avila, does not come from God. It comes from the enemy. Because the enemy knows perfectly well that as long as the soul is ashamed to confess, the confessional remains closed. And as long as the confessional remains closed, the door of grace is closed too. The third reason is the most subtle and the most widespread among souls who have lived their faith for many years, that the feeling that there is simply nothing left to confess. The Christian who has decades of sacramental life behind them, who receives communion every Sunday, who prays the rosary, who practices their devotions, reaches a point where confession seems almost unnecessary. Not because they are living in mortal sin, but because their sins are so small, so habitual, so repetitive, that it no longer seems worth the trouble of bringing them. God already knows them. They know them themselves. They have already confessed them 100 times, and they keep coming back anyway. Saint Teresa of Avila answered that logic with a clarity that leaves no escape. She said that precisely this, the repetition of the same sins, is the most urgent reason to keep confessing them. Because the grace of confession does not only forgive sin already committed, it strengthens the soul against future sin. And the soul that stops going to confession because it always falls into the same things is giving up precisely the grace it needs to stop falling into those things. In the interior castle, Saint Teresa of Avila described the soul that has abandoned frequent confession as a castle with all its windows sealed shut. No fresh air, no light, no renewal. Everything inside remains exactly as it is, without movement, without growth, without the current of grace that the sacrament produces, and that is the only means God has established for the soul's continuous spiritual growth. And there is something Saint Teresa of Avila added about confession during the Easter season that makes this seventh sin especially urgent to address today, this Easter Monday. She said that the Church did not establish by accident the obligation to go to confession at least once a year during the Easter season, that this obligation has a deep spiritual foundation. Easter is the time when the grace for conversion is greater than at any other moment of the year, the time when God's mercy is, so to speak, closer to the surface, more accessible, more ready to receive the soul that comes with its wounds and its weariness and its repetitions and its fears. Not going to confession during this season means letting pass an opportunity that Saint Teresa of Avila considered irreplaceable in the most literal sense. This Easter Monday will not come again. This specific grace of this day, of this week, will have no second chance to be received, because liturgical grace has its own timing, its own rhythm, its own moments of greater intensity and lesser intensity. And the Easter season is the moment of greatest intensity in the entire year. Have you been to confession this Easter season? Or is there something from what we have explored together, any one of the 7 sins that Saint Teresa of Avila identified, that you feel you still need to bring before a priest? This Easter Monday, there is still time. The churches are open, the confessionals are available, and the grace waiting on the other side of that door is exactly the grace that Saint Teresa of Avila promised for the soul that has the courage to walk in. A courage that is not the courage of someone who is unafraid. It is the courage of someone who is afraid and enters anyway. The courage of one who knows that on the other side there is no judge waiting to condemn, but a Father waiting to embrace. And what Saint Teresa of Avila wrote about what happens in the soul after that Easter Monday confession, after having crossed that threshold with these 7 sins in hand, is what remains for us to receive together. Saint Teresa of Avila never described confession as a formality. She never described it as an obligation to be completed and set aside. Throughout all her spiritual thought, in all her writings, confession appears as what she herself lived in the most decisive moment of her life, a door that, when opened with truth, changes everything on the other side. There was a confessor that Saint Teresa of Avila described in the book of her life as the instrument God used to transform her interior life for good. He was not a man of extraordinary theological learning. He was not a man of great intellectual gifts. He was a man who listened with patience and who pronounced the words of absolution with a conviction that Saint Teresa of Avila could physically feel. And in one of the confessions she made with him, a moment she described as the most important of her entire spiritual life, something broke open inside her, something that had been closed for years, something that no private prayer, no resolution of amendment, no act of will had been able to move. What broke open was the soul's last resistance to giving itself completely. And Saint Teresa of Avila spent the rest of her life trying to explain to her sisters and her spiritual directors what had happened in that moment, trying to convey the certainty she had acquired in that instant, a certainty that never left her again, that the sacrament of confession has a power that completely transcends human capacity, that it is not the priest who forgives, it is Christ. And when Christ forgives through the priest, he does not only erase the sin, he rebuilds the soul from within. How does one prepare for the Easter Monday confession in the spirit of Saint Teresa of Avila? Not with a list of sins prepared in advance with cold calculation, not with the attitude of someone filing a report. Saint Teresa of Avila asked for something far simpler and far more demanding at the same time. Go to the confessional with truth, with the truth of who you actually are right now, with the truth of the 7 sins we have walked through together, whichever ones apply, whichever ones the soul recognizes as its own. The performed joy carried in silence, the resentment that outlasted the resurrection, the lukewarmness that returned after the Lenten effort, the spiritual pride that prevents receiving, the forgetting of the departed in a time of celebration, the Eucharistic ingratitude, the confessional door that has been avoided for too long. You don't need to name them all in theological terms. You don't need to use the precise vocabulary of moral theology. Saint Teresa of Avila asked only for honesty, the honesty of someone who enters the confessional the way the prodigal son entered his father's house, without a prepared speech, without arguments, with only one certainty in their heart: I have drifted away and I want to come home. In The Way of Perfection, Saint Teresa of Avila described a practice she recommended to her sisters before going to confession, one of such simplicity that it reaches the heart without effort. She asked that before entering, the soul pause a moment in silence and speak to God in its own words, without formulas, without memorized prayers, telling Him exactly what it was feeling in that moment, not what it should feel, not what it expected to feel, what it actually felt. Fear, if there was fear, shame, if there was shame, weariness, if there was weariness, joy, if there was joy. All of it spoken to God with a child's simplicity before crossing the threshold of the confessional, because Saint Teresa of Avila knew that the soul which enters the confessional, having already spoken with God about what it carries, enters differently, enters with the heart already a little more open, already a little less guarded, already a little more ready to receive what the sacrament has to give. And what the sacrament has to give on this Easter Monday is something that Saint Teresa of Avila described in the interior castle, with an image that draws together all the threads of everything we have walked through. The image of the castle that finally opens its inner doors. The castle that throughout all of Lent was preparing itself, that on Easter night saw the light of the resurrection begin to come through the outer windows, and that in the Easter Monday confession at last opens the doors of its innermost rooms, its most hidden chambers, its most closely guarded spaces, so that the light can reach all the way into the last corner. That is the effect of a confession made in truth during the Easter season. Not only the forgiveness of sins, the complete renewal of the soul from within, the sensation that Saint Teresa of Avila described as the closest thing to resurrection that the soul can experience in this life. To feel that something which was dead inside you begins to move again. To feel that something which was closed is opening. To feel that the weight you were carrying this morning, when you began to hear these words, is no longer where it was. That is what waits on the other side of the confessional door this Easter Monday. Saint Teresa of Avila promised it, not with the authority of her personal merits, but with the authority of someone who lived that pain and that liberation in her own flesh, who walked that road and dedicated her entire life to marking the path so that others would not take as long to find it. Today is the day. The grace is available. The castle can open completely. And what Saint Teresa of Avila left written for the soul that takes that step, the promise she preserved in her pages for those who come to the confessional with 7 sins in hand and a heart ready to let them go, is what remains for us to receive together. You have walked today through something that very few souls dare to walk with true honesty. The 7 sins that Saint Teresa of Avila identified as the most common obstacles between the devout Christian and the full grace of the resurrection. The performed joy that carries in silence what has not been surrendered. The resentment that survives Easter because it has not yet found the words to be released. The lukewarmness that returns after the Lenten effort, as though the soul needed rest at precisely the moment when grace is most available. The spiritual pride that comes before God with hands full of its own works and cannot receive because it already feels satisfied. the forgetting of the departed in a time of joy, those souls still waiting in purgatory for the prayers that the living reserve only for times of silence, never for times of celebration. The Eucharistic ingratitude that receives the risen Christ and returns to its affairs before that communion has been able to do everything it came to do. And the seventh, the closed door of the confessional, the sin that causes all the others to stay exactly where they are. You have seen them, you have recognized them, and recognizing them, as Saint Teresa of Avila would say, is already the soul's first movement toward freedom. There are souls who, after hearing something like what you have heard today, feel that they need to continue, that this is not the moment to stop, that what has begun here deserves to be deepened, extended, taken further still. And if that is what you feel right now, if there is in you that hunger to keep receiving what Saint Teresa of Avila left written for the souls who seek God with seriousness, then I want to say something to you. This is not the only path that Saint Teresa of Avila left mapped out for us. There are other teachings of hers, other mysteries she explored with that courage that made her a doctor of the Church, that are waiting to be received by a soul that has already taken the step you took today, a soul that has already looked inward with honesty, a soul that already knows that authentic faith is not the faith that avoids difficult questions, but the faith that brings them directly before God. Saint Teresa of Avila spent decades exploring the deepest territories of the interior life, territories that most Christians know only by name, but have never truly inhabited: the prayer of quiet, the interior mansions, the union of the soul with God that she described as the most real experience a human being can have in this life. These teachings are not for perfect souls. They are exactly for souls like yours, souls that have had the honesty to look at their 7 sins without turning away, souls that understand that the spiritual journey does not end with a single confession, but begins again with each one. What Saint Teresa of Avila still has to say to you is a great deal, and there is a video waiting for you exactly where this one ends, ready for the soul that has come this far and feels the desire to go on. Don't go searching for it. Let it come to you. Because Saint Teresa of Avila always said that the graces God prepares for the soul are not to be pursued with effort. You need only be still with an open heart and allow them to arrive. That is the soul you are right now. And that stillness, that openness, that desire for more, it is precisely the disposition that Saint Teresa of Avila said was needed in order to receive what comes next. Thank you for having come this far, for having had the courage to listen, for having looked inward on a day when it would have been so much easier to stay on the surface of Easter joy and ask no further questions. Saint Teresa of Avila once wrote in The Way of Perfection these words that today belong to you: "May the Lord give us light so that we do not walk in darkness, and so that the good we have begun we may carry through to its completion." May the risen Christ complete in your soul today what he began at Easter. May the confession you make, if you have not yet made it, be the freest and the most truthful of your life. And may this Easter Monday be remembered in your heart not as the day after the celebration, but as the first day of something new. God bless you. May Saint Teresa of Avila intercede for you, and may the peace that the world cannot give be yours today and always.